The notification lit up his phone screen at 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening. He was sitting on the deck of his new beach house, watching the waves roll in under a sky painted purple and gold, when the message arrived. "We heard you bought a beach house. We deserve a key." The words hit him like a punch to the chest. No greeting, no congratulations, no acknowledgement of the years of silence that had stretched between them like an ocean. Just a demand, bold and unapologetic, as if they had every right to what he'd built. He stared at the screen, his wife's hand finding his shoulder from behind. She'd seen the name. She knew what it meant. "Don't answer tonight," she whispered. But his mind was already somewhere else. It was traveling back through time, to a day that should have been the happiest of his life, to a moment when 2 chairs sat empty while everyone else celebrated. He could still see them, the white chairs with their satin bows, positioned in the front row where the most important people were supposed to sit. The small placards reading "Mother" and "Father" in elegant calligraphy designed by his wife's sister who'd stayed up late to make them perfect. Those chairs never moved, not once during the entire ceremony. His wife had squeezed his hand so hard during their vows that his fingers went numb, but he understood. She was trying to hold him together, trying to make her grip strong enough for both of them. She was pretending it didn't hurt to watch him glance toward those empty seats every few minutes, hoping against hope that they'd show up late, that there'd been traffic, that something had delayed them. They never came. Before we get into it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and hit hype to boost this episode. Drop a comment below with your city or country. I'm always curious where viewers are joining from. The flowers he'd ordered specially for his mother wilted in their vase. The boutonniere meant for his father remained in its box. The seats stayed empty, a silent testament to absence, to choices made, to priorities revealed. Now 3 years later, they wanted a key. He looked down at his phone again, reading the message one more time. His thumb hovered over the keyboard, 1,000 responses flooding his mind. But none of them seemed adequate for this moment, for the audacity of what they were asking. His wife's voice came again, softer this time. "What are you thinking?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he thought about everything that had led to this moment, to this house, to this life they'd built together despite every obstacle his family had placed in their path. "I'm thinking," he finally said, his voice steady and calm, "that it's time they got an answer they'll never forget." Growing up, he'd always known his place in the family hierarchy. It wasn't something anyone explicitly stated, but it was understood, felt in every overlooked achievement and every dismissive comment. His sister was the golden child. She was 3 years younger, effortlessly charming, blessed with the kind of natural charisma that made people gravitate toward her. Their parents orbited around her like she was the sun, and he was just a distant planet, cold and unremarkable. When she made the honor roll, there were celebrations. Dinner at her favorite restaurant, new clothes, a post on their mother's social media with 3 paragraphs about how proud they were. When he made the honor roll, his mother said, "That's nice, honey," without looking up from her phone. His sister's dance recitals were mandatory family events. His father would take off work early. His mother would arrive an hour before showtime to get the best seat. They'd bring flowers and film everything. His basketball games? They came to 1, maybe 2 per season. Usually, they'd sit in the back, leave at halftime, and forget to ask about the score. Birthdays were another stark reminder. His sister's birthdays were productions, themed parties with dozens of guests, custom cakes, presents that had clearly been thought about for months. His birthdays were quiet affairs. Sometimes they'd remember to get a cake from the grocery store. Sometimes they wouldn't. The worst was his 16th birthday. His parents had thrown his sister an elaborate Sweet 16 party just 8 months earlier, complete with a DJ, professional photographer, and a car as a surprise gift. When his 16th came around, they took him to dinner at a chain restaurant, gave him a $50 gift card, and spent most of the meal on their phones. "You're not really a party person anyway," his mother had said when he'd quietly asked if there would be anything special. "We didn't think you'd want all that fuss." He hadn't been brave enough to say that maybe he did want the fuss, that maybe he wanted to feel like he mattered as much as his sister did. High school graduation was another wound. His sister's graduation had been a family reunion, complete with out-of-town relatives, a backyard barbecue, and a video montage of her achievements that his mother had spent weeks creating. His graduation? His parents came to the ceremony, took 1 photo, and left immediately after because his father had a golf game scheduled. "You understand," his mother had said. "You're so independent. You don't need all that attention like your sister does." But independence wasn't something he'd chosen. It was something that had been forced upon him, a armor he'd developed because needing them had only ever led to disappointment. College was when the pattern crystallized into something he could finally name: neglect dressed up as trust, abandonment disguised as confidence in his abilities. They helped his sister move into her dorm, stayed the whole weekend, cried when they left. When it was his turn, they dropped him off, helped him carry 2 boxes upstairs, and were gone within an hour. "You've got this," his father had said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You're the capable one. The capable one, the independent one, the one who could manage on his own." It sounded like a compliment, but it felt like an excuse, an easy way to justify their absence, their disinterest, their favoritism. After college, he'd done what he'd always done, figured it out on his own. He worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. During the day, he was an assistant at a marketing firm, doing grunt work for barely minimum wage. At night, he waited tables at an upscale restaurant downtown, smiling through the exhaustion, pocketing tips that would eventually become his future. On weekends, he did freelance design work, teaching himself skills from YouTube videos and online courses he could barely afford. His parents never asked about any of it. His sister, meanwhile, had gotten a job at their father's friend's company, a comfortable position with a comfortable salary that had been handed to her without an application process. "You're so lucky," he told her once, trying not to sound bitter. "It's not luck," she'd replied, completely serious. "It's about networking. You should try it sometime." He'd wanted to laugh, or scream. Instead, he just nodded and changed the subject. It took him 4 years to save enough money to start his own business. A small digital marketing agency, just him and a laptop in his cramped apartment, working 18-hour days to land clients and build a reputation. When he told his parents about it, his mother's response was immediate and cutting. "That's risky," she'd said. "What if it fails? You're not really the entrepreneur type." His father had been even worse. "Beach houses are for people smarter than you," he'd said during a family dinner, apropos of nothing, just a casual cruelty dropped into conversation. People who make real money, not people playing around with websites. He'd been talking about a client he'd landed, someone who owned a vacation property and needed social media management. But his father had twisted it into an insult, a reminder that in their eyes he'd never measure up. His sister had laughed, his mother had smiled, and he'd sat there, fork frozen halfway to his mouth, wondering why he'd even bothered to come. The comments continued over the years, little barbs disguised as concern or jokes. "Your wife will leave when she realizes what she married. You should have gotten a real job instead of this hobby. We worry about you, you know. You're not like your sister. She has stability." Every achievement he shared was met with skepticism. Every success was downplayed or attributed to luck. Every plan for the future was questioned or mocked. When his business finally started to thrive, when he landed major clients and hired his first employees, when he moved out of his apartment and into a real house, they said nothing. No congratulations, no acknowledgement. Just silence. But his sister got a promotion at the company where she'd been handed her job, and their parents threw her a celebration dinner, invited everyone they knew, posted about it endlessly on social media. He'd stopped expecting anything from them by then. He'd built his life despite them, not because of them. He had his wife, his business, his own chosen family of friends who actually showed up. He thought he'd made peace with it, with being the forgotten child, the afterthought, the one who didn't matter enough to warrant their time or pride. But then came the wedding. The wedding day had arrived with perfect weather, sunny but not too hot, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of the ocean from the venue they'd chosen, a beautiful garden overlooking the water. Everything was exactly as they'd planned it, down to the smallest detail. Everything except the 2 empty chairs in the front row. He'd known, deep down, that there was a chance they wouldn't come. His parents had been weird about the wedding from the moment he'd announced his engagement. Not overtly hostile, but distant, lukewarm, making comments that stung. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" his mother had asked. "Marriage is a big commitment," his father had added. "Bigger than most people your age can handle." He was 28. His sister had gotten married at 26, and they'd called it a fairy tale come true. The wedding invitation had been beautiful. His wife had spent weeks choosing the design, the paper, the wording. They'd hand-delivered his parents' invitation, sitting in their living room while his mother examined it with barely concealed disinterest. "Nice," she'd said. "We'll see if we can make it." "We'll see?" he'd repeated. "Mom, it's 8 months away. I'm telling you now so you can plan." "We have a lot going on," his father had interjected. "We can't just drop everything." But they could drop everything for his sister. They'd flown to 3 different cities for her wedding events, the engagement party, the bridal shower, the bachelorette weekend. They'd been involved in every decision, every detail. For his wedding, they couldn't commit to showing up. The months leading up to the wedding were filled with vague responses and deflections. When he'd ask directly if they were coming, they'd say things like probably, or we're planning on it, or as long as nothing comes up. His wife had been patient at first, making excuses for them, trying to see their side. Maybe they're just busy, she'd said. Maybe they'll surprise you and be super involved as it gets closer. But as the wedding approached and they remained distant, barely responding to messages about details, not offering to help with anything, she'd started to see what he'd always known. They didn't care. The week before the wedding, he'd called one last time. "Just confirming you're coming," he'd said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need to give final numbers to the caterer." "We'll be there," his mother had said, but her tone was flat, obligatory. "Both of you?" he'd pressed. "Yes, both of us. Stop worrying so much." But they weren't there. He'd stood at the altar, his wife walking down the aisle looking absolutely radiant, and he'd glanced at those front row seats one more time, still hoping, still that little boy, desperate for his parents' approval. Empty. The ceremony proceeded. The officiant spoke about love and commitment and family. Guests smiled and dabbed at their eyes. His wife's parents beamed from their seats across the aisle, and his parents' chairs remained vacant. He could feel people noticing. The whispers started subtle but grew louder. His uncle, sitting 2 rows back, kept glancing at the empty seats with a confused frown. His wife's aunt leaned over to whisper something to her husband. During their vows, his wife's voice cracked slightly. Not because she was emotional about the promises they were making, though she was, but because she could see the pain in his eyes every time his gaze drifted to those chairs. She squeezed his hands tighter, anchoring him to the moment, to her, to the life they were choosing together. "I'm here," she whispered, off script. "I'm always here." He'd nodded, blinking back tears that weren't entirely happy ones. The reception was worse in some ways. There were assigned seats at the head table, places of honor for immediate family. His wife's parents sat on her side. His sister, who had come but spent the entire ceremony on her phone, sat on his side. The 2 seats next to his sister, meant for his mother and father, sat empty all night. Guests kept asking, "Where are your parents? Are they okay? Did something happen?" He'd smiled through it, offering vague responses. "They couldn't make it," he'd say. "Something came up." But inside, he was breaking. His wife had found him in a quiet corner after dinner, before the dancing started. He was standing alone, staring out at the garden, trying to compose himself. "Hey," she'd said softly, taking his hand. "Hey. You okay?" He'd wanted to say yes. He'd wanted to be strong, to not let their absence ruin this perfect day she'd worked so hard to plan. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was, "Why don't they love me?" She'd pulled him into her arms, and he'd cried into her shoulder, this grown man in his wedding tuxedo, finally letting out years of accumulated hurt. "I don't know," she'd whispered, "but I do. I love you so much, and everyone here loves you. We're your family now." Later, after they'd cut the cake and done their first dance and thrown the bouquet, after most of the guests had left and they were in their hotel room, still in their wedding clothes, his phone had buzzed. It was his sister. "Sorry they didn't make it. You know how they are? Don't take it personally." Don't take it personally. As if their absence from his wedding was just a quirk, an inconvenience, something he was overreacting about by caring. He'd turned off his phone and held his wife, wondering how it was possible to feel so loved and so abandoned on the same day. They didn't call. Not that night, not the next day, not even the day after that. A week after the wedding, while he and his wife were still on their honeymoon, trying to enjoy the Caribbean sunshine despite the cloud hanging over them, his mother finally sent a text. "Hope the wedding was nice. We were busy." That was it. No apology, no explanation. Just 5 words that dismissed the most important day of his life as if it were a casual brunch they'd skipped. He'd stared at the message for a long time, his wife reading over his shoulder. "Busy," she'd repeated, her voice tight with anger. They were busy. He'd called when they got back, against his wife's advice. She told him to let it go, to accept that they'd never give him what he needed, but he couldn't. He needed to hear them say it, to explain, to give him something that made sense. His mother answered on the 4th ring. "Oh, hi, honey," she'd said as if nothing was wrong. "How was the honeymoon?" "Why weren't you at my wedding?" he'd asked, skipping the pleasantries. A pause. Then, "I told you, we were busy." "Busy with what, exactly?" Another pause, longer this time. He could hear his father in the background, saying something he couldn't make out. "Your father had a work thing," she'd finally said. "It was important. We couldn't get out of it." "You knew about the wedding for 8 months." "Well, we didn't know about this work thing until later. These things happen. You should understand, being a business owner yourself." The casual way she said it, as if missing your son's wedding was equivalent to missing a casual business meeting, made his blood boil. Mom, it was my wedding. You didn't even call or text. You just didn't show up. We figured you'd be too busy to notice, she'd said, and he could hear the defensiveness creeping into her voice. You had all those people there. What difference would 2 more make? You're my parents. And you're an adult. You don't need us there to hold your hand. The conversation had gone in circles after that. Every point he made was deflected, minimized, or turned back on him. His father got on the phone at one point and made it worse. You should have picked a different date, he'd said. You know we're busy in the spring. You went to 3 different cities for sister's wedding events. That was different. She needed us there. She was stressed about the planning. You seemed to have everything under control. There it was again. That convenient excuse. He was capable, independent, didn't need them. His sister was delicate, needed support, required their presence. It was always the same story. When he'd finally hung up, frustrated and hurt, and no closer to understanding, his wife had been waiting. What did they say? She'd asked. That it wasn't important, that I should have picked a different date, that they didn't think I'd care. She'd pulled him close, fierce and protective. They're wrong. It was important. You have every right to be hurt, and they should have been there. But they hadn't been, and according to them, he was wrong to expect it, wrong to be hurt, wrong to think their absence mattered. In the weeks and months that followed, they'd occasionally reach out, brief texts about mundane things, never acknowledging the elephant in the room. They'd invite him to family dinners where they'd act like nothing had happened. He'd gone to a few, trying to maintain some relationship, but it hurt every time. His sister would talk about her life, their parents would listen raptly. He'd mention his business or his wife or anything going on with him, and they'd nod vaguely, change the subject, or just scroll through their phones. Eventually, he'd stopped going, stopped calling, stopped trying. His wife had been relieved. You don't need that toxicity in your life, she'd said. We'll build our own family, our own traditions. And they had. For 3 years, they'd lived their life without his parents in it. It had been peaceful, in a way. No more expectations that would inevitably be disappointed. No more hoping they'd change or suddenly start caring. He'd made his peace with it, or so he'd thought, until that text arrived 3 years later, asking for a key to his beach house. The beach house had been a dream for years. He and his wife would talk about it late at night, lying in bed, planning their someday life. A place by the ocean where they could escape the chaos of the city, where they could raise kids eventually, where they could build memories. It had seemed impossible for so long. Even as his business grew and became successful, even as the money started coming in steadily, the idea of a $1.8 million beach house felt like fantasy. But last year, everything had aligned. His company had landed 3 major contracts. His wife's career had taken off. They'd been smart with their money, invested wisely, and suddenly the impossible was within reach. They'd spent months house hunting, falling in love with properties only to lose them to other buyers, getting discouraged and then hopeful again. When they finally found it, the perfect house right on the beach, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a deck that seemed to float over the sand, they'd known immediately. The offer had been accepted within 24 hours. Closing day had felt surreal. Signing the papers, getting the keys, driving up to their beach house for the first time as owners. His wife had cried happy tears. He'd felt a sense of accomplishment so profound it was almost overwhelming. They'd earned this, through hard work, sacrifice, long hours, and longer years of building something from nothing. He'd posted 1 photo on social media. Just one. The view from their new deck at sunset, waves crashing in golden light, the caption simple, "New chapter." He'd shared it because he was proud, because he wanted to document this milestone, because after years of struggle and doubt, he wanted to mark the moment when it had all paid off. Within minutes, his phone had started buzzing, friends congratulating them, colleagues liking and commenting, his wife's family calling to celebrate. And then, after 3 years of near-total silence, his mother had called. He'd stared at her name on the screen, debating whether to answer. His wife had been across the room unpacking boxes, and she'd looked up when she heard his phone ring. "Who is it?" she'd asked. "My mom." Her expression had shifted immediately. "Don't answer if you don't want to." But curiosity got the better of him. After 3 years of nothing, what could possibly prompt her to call now? He'd answered. "Hello?" "Hi, honey." His mother's voice had been bright, cheerful, as if they'd talked yesterday. "I saw your post. A beach house. How exciting." No, how have you been? No, I'm sorry we haven't talked. No acknowledgement of the years of silence or the wedding they'd missed or the hurt they'd caused. just immediate enthusiasm about his beach house. "Yeah," he'd said cautiously. "We're really happy with it." "I bet. It looks gorgeous. Right on the beach, it looks like?" "Yeah, it is." "Well, we're so proud of you," she'd said, and he'd almost laughed at the absurdity. Proud of him. Now, when he'd bought something impressive enough to warrant their attention. "Thanks," he'd said, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. "So listen," she'd continued, her tone shifting slightly, becoming more casual, as if she were about to ask for something simple and obvious. "Your father and I were thinking it would be great to have a key, for weekends when you're not using it. It would be a shame for it to sit empty." The audacity of it had stolen his breath. A key. She wanted a key. After missing his wedding, after years of neglect, after making him feel worthless his entire life, she thought she could just ask for access to his beach house and he'd hand it over. "A key," he'd repeated. "Well, yes. We're family. It makes sense. We could help keep an eye on the place when you're not there, and it would give us a nice getaway spot. You know how stressful work has been for your father." Work that had been more important than his wedding, apparently. "Mom, I don't think—" "Oh, and your sister mentioned she'd love to bring the kids sometime. They're getting to that age where beach trips are so fun. The upstairs would be perfect for them." She'd already planned it out, already decided how they'd divide up his house, his space, the sanctuary he and his wife had worked for years to afford. "I need to talk to my wife," he'd said, his voice tight. Of course, but I'm sure she'll agree. She's always been so sweet. Just let us know when we can pick up the key." She'd hung up before he could respond. He'd stood there, phone in hand, staring at nothing while his wife walked over. "What did she want?" she'd asked, though her tone suggested she already knew it wouldn't be good. "A key to the house." His wife's eyes had widened. "She what?" "She wants a key, for weekends. She's already planning which rooms they'll use." For a moment, his wife had been speechless. Then quietly, she'd said, "After everything they've done, after missing our wedding, after years of treating you like you don't matter, they want access to what we built?" "Apparently we're family," he'd said bitterly. "So it makes sense." The calls and texts hadn't stopped after that first conversation. The next day, his father had called. The conversation had been brief, man to man, as if they were discussing a business arrangement. "Your mother told me about the beach house situation," he'd said. "Smart investment. You're finally making the kind of decisions that matter." Finally. As if everything he'd done before now had been worthless. "Thanks," he'd said flatly. "So about that key, we were thinking we'd take the master bedroom when we visit. Makes sense, given our age. We'll need the downstairs bedroom, easier on our knees." Our age. They were in their early 60s, healthy and active. But suddenly they needed accommodation, consideration, special treatment. For his wedding, they'd been too busy. For his beach house, they were too old to climb stairs. "Dad, I haven't agreed to give you a key." "Don't be difficult about this," his father had said, his tone hardening. "We raised you. We provided for you. You wouldn't even have been able to buy this house if we hadn't given you a foundation." The revisionist history was stunning. They'd provided the bare minimum, and even that had been grudging. Every success he'd had was despite them, not because of them. "I need to think about it," he'd said. "What's there to think about? We're your parents. This is what family does. You help each other out." Help each other out. Except they'd never helped him. Not when it mattered. Not when he'd needed it. His sister had texted later that day. "Hey, Mom told me about the beach house. So exciting. The kids are already asking when we can visit. I was thinking maybe Memorial Day weekend. We could make it a family thing. Mom and Dad can take the master, me and John and the kids can take the upstairs, and you guys can take the smaller bedroom. Or maybe you weren't planning to be there that weekend. Either way works." She'd planned an entire vacation at his house without asking. Assigned bedrooms, relegated him and his wife to the smallest room in their own home, or assumed they wouldn't even be there. The entitlement was breathtaking. Over the next week, the messages had continued, each one escalating. His mother had sent a text with a list of dietary restrictions for when they visited, noting that his father couldn't eat dairy anymore and she preferred organic vegetables. His sister had sent links to beach toys for kids, suggesting he stock up before their visit. His father had called to discuss the house's security system and whether they'd need a code or just the key. None of them seemed to consider that he might say no. It was already decided in their minds. The beach house was theirs to use, and his job was simply to facilitate their access. His wife had been increasingly angry on his behalf. "You can't let them do this," she'd said one night. "You can't let them waltz back into your life just because you have something they want." "I know," he'd said. They didn't come to our wedding. They don't call, they don't visit, they don't ask about our lives. But now they want a key to the beach house. Now they're planning family vacations at our place. I know. So what are you going to do? That had been the question, wasn't it? What was he going to do? For years he'd tried to win their approval, their love, their attention. He'd worked hard, achieved success, built a life he was proud of, all while hoping that someday they'd see him, really see him, and be proud. But they never had. And they never would. They didn't want him. They wanted what he had. I'm going to give them an answer, he'd finally said, one they'll never forget. He'd thought carefully about how to handle it. Part of him wanted to simply send a text, short and clear, ending the conversation before it could escalate further. But another part of him, the part that had been hurt and dismissed and overlooked for decades, wanted them to understand, wanted them to feel the weight of their choices. So he'd called his mother. "Hey, Mom," he'd said when she answered. "About the beach house." "Oh, good," she'd said immediately. "Did you get a key made? Your father wants to come down next weekend if that works." "Actually, I was thinking you and Dad should come see it first. Come for lunch on Saturday. We can talk about everything then." There'd been a pause. "Talk about what?" "Just give us the key and we'll figure it out." "I'd prefer to talk in person. It's important." Another pause, longer this time. He could almost hear her recalculating, trying to figure out what this meant. "Fine," she'd finally said. "Saturday at noon?" "Perfect. See you then." He'd extended the same invitation to his sister, though he'd been less formal about it. "Family meeting at the beach house," he'd texted. "Saturday noon, be there." His wife had been nervous. "Are you sure about this?" she'd asked. "Having them here, in our space?" "I'm sure. They need to see what they'll never have." Saturday morning had arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze. The house looked perfect, exactly the way they'd envisioned it when they'd first walked through. Sun streaming through the windows, the ocean stretching out endlessly beyond the deck, everything in its place. His parents had arrived first, pulling up in their luxury SUV, dressed as if they were going to a casual but upscale brunch. His mother wore oversized sunglasses and a linen outfit that probably cost more than his first car. His father had on expensive casual wear, the kind that looked effortless but wasn't. They'd barely greeted him before walking past, eyes already scanning the house, assessing, evaluating. "Beautiful," his mother had murmured, running her hand along the marble kitchen counter. "Even better than the photo." His father had walked straight to the windows overlooking the ocean. "Good investment," he'd said approvingly. "Property values here will only go up." They weren't seeing a home. They were seeing an asset, a vacation property, a trophy. His sister had arrived 15 minutes later with her husband and kids. The children had immediately run toward the beach, their parents calling after them half-heartedly. "This is amazing," his sister had said, doing her own tour of the space. "The upstairs is perfect for the kids. They'll love it here." They'd all gathered in the living room eventually, his parents on the main couch, his sister and brother-in-law on the love seat, the kids playing by the windows. His wife had stayed close to him, a united front. "So," his mother had said, settling in as if she already owned the place. "About that key, we were thinking—" "Let me talk first," he'd interrupted. Something in his tone made her pause, made all of them pause. The room had gone quiet except for the sound of the waves outside. He'd stood in the center of the room, his wife beside him, looking at his family. Really looking at them. His mother, already planning redecorating changes in her head, he could tell. His father, calculating investment returns. His sister, mentally arranging playdates and summer vacations. Her husband, just along for the ride. The kids, innocent in all of this, just excited about the beach. For a moment, he'd felt the old urge to give in, to make peace, to hand over what they wanted, so he could finally earn their approval. But then he'd remembered the empty chairs at his wedding, his wife crying in the dressing room, years of being invisible, dismissed, forgotten, and he'd found his resolve. "I want to tell you all something," he'd begun, his voice steady. "Something I should have said years ago." His mother had smiled indulgently. "Honey, we don't need a big speech. We're just talking about sharing the beach house." "I'm not giving you a key," he'd said. The smile had frozen on her face. "What?" "I'm not giving you a key. Not this weekend, not ever. You're not welcome to use this house." His father had stood up. "Now wait just a minute." "No, you wait." The words had come out stronger than he'd expected. "You want to talk about family? Let's talk about family. Let's talk about how you missed my wedding, how you didn't call, didn't apologize, didn't even seem to care that your absence on the most important day of my life broke my heart." His mother had opened her mouth to speak, but he'd continued. Let's talk about how for my entire life, I've been the afterthought, the backup child, the one who didn't need attention or love or support because I was capable. Meanwhile, you gave everything to her. He'd gestured toward his sister, who'd been staring at him with wide eyes. That's not fair, his sister had said weakly. Isn't it? You got the parties, the celebrations, the support, the job handed to you. I got told I wasn't smart enough for beach houses and that my wife would leave me when she realized what she'd married. His father's face had gone red. We never said? You did. You said exactly that. Both of you have spent years making me feel worthless while celebrating every mundane thing she did. The room had been crackling with tension now. His mother had taken off her sunglasses, her expression shifting from shock to anger. So this is about keeping score, she'd asked? About punishing us because you felt overlooked? No, he'd said quietly. This is about boundaries. About recognizing that you don't get to treat someone terribly for decades and then show up demanding things when they finally succeed. His wife had squeezed his hand, her support anchoring him. You didn't come to our wedding, he'd continued. You've barely spoken to me in 3 years. You've never met my colleagues, never asked about my business, never shown any interest in my life. But you'll see one photo of a beach house, and suddenly you're calling, planning vacations, acting like we're a close family. We are family, his mother had said, her voice rising. You can't just cut us out because your feelings are hurt. I'm not cutting you out. You were never really in. And that's the truth you can't face. You chose this. Years of choosing her over me, choosing everything else over me. You chose not to come to my wedding. Those were your choices. His sister had stood up now too, her face flushed. So what? We're just supposed to accept that you're better than us now? That you've made money and bought a house and now we're not good enough for you? You're missing the point, his wife had interjected, her voice calm but firm. He's not saying he's better. He's saying you hurt him, repeatedly, and now you want access to what he's built without ever acknowledging that hurt. This is ridiculous, his father had said. We're your parents. We raised you. You owe us. I owe you nothing, he'd said, and the finality in his voice had stopped his father mid-sentence. I don't owe you gratitude for doing the bare minimum. I don't owe you access to my life because we share DNA. I don't owe you anything except honesty, and here it is. You failed me. As parents, you failed me, and I've spent too many years trying to earn love that you were never going to give. He'd reached into his pocket then and pulled out an envelope. It was thick, official-looking, and his mother's eyes had narrowed when she'd seen it. What is that? She'd asked. This, he'd said, holding it up, is a letter from my attorney, and it's a formal cease and desist regarding this property. A cease and desist? His father had barked out a laugh, though it sounded forced. Against your own parents? Against anyone who attempts to claim rights to this property or access it without explicit permission from me or my wife. It also formally requests that you stop contacting us about this matter. He'd placed the envelope on the coffee table between them. You're going to legally ban us from your beach house? His sister had asked, incredulous. You're threatening us with lawyers? I'm protecting my peace, he'd said simply. And my marriage. And my future. I'm done hoping you'll change. I'm done making excuses for you. I'm done pretending that your behavior is okay just because you're family. His mother's eyes had filled with tears, but they looked more angry than sad. I can't believe you're doing this. After everything we've done for you? What have you done for me? He'd asked. Specifically, tell me one thing you've done for me in the past 5 years. One phone call checking on me, one conversation where you asked about my life, one moment where you made me feel like I mattered to you. The silence had been deafening. His mother had looked at his father had looked at his sister had looked at the floor. None of them had an answer. That's what I thought, he'd said softly. His father had picked up the envelope, his hands shaking slightly with anger. You're going to regret this. Maybe, but I doubt it. You can't just cut off your family, his mother had said, standing now, her voice breaking. That's not how this works. You cut me off years ago, he'd replied. I'm just finally accepting it. His sister had gathered her kids, her expression tight with fury. This is so typical of you, always the victim, always acting like you had it so hard. Grow up. I did grow up, he'd said. That's the problem. I grew up and realized I deserve better than how you've all treated me. They'd left then, his parents storming out first, his father crumpling the envelope in his fist. His sister had lingered for just a moment, her eyes meeting his. You're making a mistake, she'd said quietly. No, he'd replied. I'm fixing one. And then they were gone, the sound of car doors slamming and engines starting, gravel crunching under tires. The house had been quiet afterward, just him and his wife standing in the living room, the ocean view stretching out beyond the windows. "Are you okay?" she'd asked. He'd taken a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in years, despite the emotional weight of what had just happened. "Yeah," he'd said. "I really am." The phone calls had started almost immediately. His mother called 17 times that first day. He'd watched his phone screen light up with her name, over and over, and let every call go to voicemail. The voicemails were a progression of emotions. Anger first, demanding he call her back immediately, then guilt, reminding him of every sacrifice they'd allegedly made, then manipulation, crying about how he was breaking their hearts, finally, threats about cutting him out of their will, as if that had ever been something he'd counted on. His father's texts were shorter, blunter. "This is childish. You're being unreasonable. Family doesn't treat family this way." His sister had taken to social media, posting vague status updates about betrayal and ungrateful people, clearly hoping he'd see them and feel guilty. But he didn't feel guilty. For the first time in his life, when he thought about his family, he didn't feel that familiar ache of longing and disappointment. He felt free. His wife had been worried at first, checking on him constantly, making sure he didn't regret the confrontation. "I'm proud of you," she'd said that first night, as they'd sat on the deck watching the sunset. "I know that couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," he'd admitted, "but it was necessary." "Do you think they'll actually respect the boundaries?" "Honestly, I don't know. But I have the cease and desist, and if they show up here anyway, we'll deal with it." They hadn't shown up, but the calls and texts had continued for days. His mother's strategy had shifted by the end of the first week. The anger and guilt tripping had given way to a new approach. Reconciliation, but on her terms. "Maybe we can all sit down and talk about this calmly," she'd texted. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." There had been no misunderstanding. But he'd responded. The first communication he'd initiated since the confrontation. "I'm open to rebuilding a relationship eventually, but it would require genuine acknowledgement of the hurt you've caused, genuine apologies, and genuine change, not just saying sorry to get what you want." Her response had come an hour later. "We're sorry you feel hurt. Not, we're sorry we hurt you. Not, we're sorry we missed your wedding. Not, we're sorry for how we treated you. We're sorry you feel hurt." The non-apology apology, placing the blame on his feelings rather than their actions. He hadn't responded to that message, or any of the ones that followed. By the second week, the calls had slowed. By the third, they'd mostly stopped. His sister had unfriended him on social media. His parents had blocked him after one final text from his father. "When you're ready to act like an adult, you know where to find us." The silence that followed should have felt lonely, should have felt like loss. Instead, it felt like peace. It was a Saturday morning, about a month after the confrontation, when his wife found him on the deck. He'd been up early, coffee in hand, watching the waves roll in as the sun turned the sky pink and gold. The beach was empty except for a few early morning joggers and a dog chasing seagulls. She'd wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she'd asked. "How quiet it is," he'd said. "Is that good?" "Yeah, it's good." She'd kissed his cheek and moved to stand beside him, her own coffee cup warming her hands. "I'm proud of you," she'd said. "You know that, right? You keep saying that." "Because it's true. What you did took courage. Standing up to your family, setting boundaries, choosing yourself. A lot of people can't do that." "I should have done it years ago." "Maybe, but you did it when you were ready. That's what matters." They'd stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching a pelican dive for fish in the surf. "Do you think they'll ever change?" she'd asked eventually. "Honestly, no. I don't think they see themselves as having done anything wrong. In their minds, I'm the problem. I'm ungrateful, difficult, holding grudges. Does that bother you?" He'd thought about it, really thought about it. A month ago, it would have devastated him. The idea that his parents would never acknowledge their failures, never apologize, never see his perspective. But now? "It bothers me that they hurt me," he'd said slowly. "It bothers me that I'll never have the parents I deserved, but their inability to change or see the truth, that's their problem, not mine. I can't control what they think or feel. I can only control what I accept in my life." His wife had smiled, a proud, tender smile that made his chest warm. "When did you get so wise?" she'd asked. "When I married someone who showed me what love is supposed to look like." She'd laughed and kissed him, and they'd gone inside to make breakfast. The beach house filled with light and warmth and the promise of a future they'd built together. Over the following months, life had settled into a new normal. A normal without his family in it, which sometimes felt strange but increasingly felt right. He and his wife had made the beach house their sanctuary. They'd spent weekends there, invited friends, hosted small gatherings with people who actually cared about them. His wife's family had come to visit, her parents spending a week and being genuinely grateful for the invitation, helping cook meals and taking long walks on the beach with them. They'd asked about his family once, tentatively, and he'd given them the abbreviated version. "We're not in contact right now," he'd said. "It's better this way." They'd nodded, understanding, and hadn't pushed. Later, his mother-in-law had pulled him aside. "I know it's not my place," she'd said, "but I want you to know that you're our son now. You have been since the day you married our daughter, and we're proud of you. We see you, we value you, and you always have a place with us." He'd had to excuse himself after that conversation, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of being seen, being valued, being chosen. Work had continued to thrive. His business had grown, he'd hired more staff, landed even bigger clients. Without the constant emotional drain of trying to manage his family's expectations and disappointments, he'd had more energy for everything else. He'd also started going to therapy, something his wife had gently suggested, and he'd resisted at first. But his therapist had helped him process the grief of losing a family he'd never really had, the anger at years of mistreatment, and the guilt he sometimes still felt about setting boundaries. "You didn't cut them off," his therapist had said during one session. "They cut themselves off by refusing to treat you with basic respect and love. You just stopped accepting crumbs and calling it a meal." That perspective had helped more than he could articulate. There were hard days still. Days when he'd see a father and son at the beach, laughing together and feel that old ache. Days when friends would talk about their families and he'd feel the absence of his own. But mostly, there was peace. Peace in knowing he didn't have to brace himself for criticism every time he shared good news. Peace in not waiting for calls that would never come or apologies that would never be offered. Peace in building a life with people who actually wanted to be in it. One evening, about 6 months after the confrontation, he'd been cleaning out old boxes from storage and found his wedding album. He'd sat on the floor of their home office, carefully turning pages, looking at photos from that day. There were beautiful moments captured. His wife walking down the aisle, their first kiss as a married couple, their first dance. Friends and family laughing and celebrating. His wife's parents beaming with pride. And there, in one wide shot of the ceremony, you could see them, the 2 empty chairs in the front row, a stark reminder of who had chosen not to be there. He'd stared at that photo for a long time, expecting to feel the old pain resurface. But it didn't. Instead, he'd felt something else. Gratitude. Gratitude that those empty chairs had taught him a valuable lesson about who people really were. Gratitude that he'd finally stopped making excuses for them. Gratitude that he'd found the strength to choose himself, to choose his wife, to choose peace over obligation. His wife had found him sitting there and sat down beside him, looking at the album. "You okay?" she'd asked. "Yeah," he'd said, and meant it. "I was just thinking about how that day, despite everything, was still one of the best days of my life. Because of the empty chairs, or in spite of them? In spite of them. Because of you. Because of everyone else who showed up. Because it was the day I married you and started building the life I actually wanted." She'd leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm glad you're at peace with it." "Me too." They'd closed the album together and put it back in storage, a record of the past that no longer had power over the present. It was a year after the confrontation when he stood on the deck of the beach house one last time before they headed back to the city for the week. The sun was setting in brilliant oranges and purples, painting the sky like a masterpiece. The waves rolled in steady and eternal, the sound soothing and constant. His wife was inside, packing their things, humming to herself. They were expecting their first child in 4 months, a development that had filled him with joy and terror in equal measure. He thought about what kind of father he wanted to be, what kind of family he wanted to build, what lessons he'd learned from having the parents he'd had. He wouldn't be perfect, he knew that, but he'd be present, he'd show up, he'd see his child, really see them, value them, prioritize them. He'd never make them feel like an afterthought or a burden. He'd never play favorites or withhold love as punishment. He'd never miss the important moments because something else seemed more pressing. His phone buzzed in his pocket. For a moment, muscle memory made him tense, expecting it to be his mother with another attempt at reconciliation on her terms. But it was just a notification, a reminder about a doctor's appointment next week. He smiled at his own reaction. A year ago, he'd still been half hoping they'd change, that they'd realize what they'd lost and come back with genuine apologies and changed behavior. Now, he rarely thought about them at all. When he did, it was with a detached sort of sadness, the way you might think about a business deal that didn't work out or a friend who'd moved away and drifted out of contact. They'd tried a few more times over the year, birthday texts that were generic and brief, a Christmas card with a check inside, as if money could replace relationship. His sister had reached out once, asking if enough time had passed that they could move on. He'd responded simply, "I've moved on, but moving on doesn't mean going back. I'm open to building something new if there's genuine acknowledgement and change. Otherwise, I'm at peace with where we are." She hadn't responded to that. His wife had joined him on the deck, slipping her hand into his. "Ready to go?" she'd asked. "Yeah, ready." As they'd locked up the house and walked to their car, he'd looked back one more time at the place they'd built, the sanctuary they'd created, the life they'd chosen. Family didn't get a key to your life just because they share your blood. They earned it through love, through showing up, through treating you with respect and dignity. His parents had never earned that key, and he'd finally accepted that they never would. But he'd built his own family now. His wife, his child on the way, his friends who'd become like siblings, his in-laws who'd embraced him without condition. That was his family. That was who got the key. And as they drove away from the beach house, the setting sun in their rearview mirror, he felt something he'd been chasing his whole life finally settle in his chest. He felt free. He felt seen. He felt loved. And that was worth more than any key they'd ever demanded.